"Dad, we're surrounded. 450 Americans against 2,000 Japanese. I'm writing this in the bunker. If you find this diary, know that we fought until the end." These defiant words were etched into the pages of a waterproof logbook by 23-year-old Marine Corps pilot Major Paul Putnam on December 23, 1941, as Japanese forces closed in on Wake Island's final defensive positions. His hands, blackened with gunpowder and trembling from exhaustion, gripped a pencil stub as he documented what he knew would be America's last stand on a forgotten coral atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Major Putnam's logbook was discovered in 1971 by construction workers building a new radar installation on Wake Island. Hidden inside a sealed ammunition canister buried beneath the ruins of the old command bunker, the journal had survived 3 decades of Pacific storms and the passage of time. The pages, though yellowed and brittle, contained the most detailed first-person account of the 16-day siege that transformed Wake Island from an obscure military outpost into a symbol of American courage in the face of overwhelming odds. If these untold stories of American heroism and sacrifice during World War II fascinate you, make sure to subscribe to our channel because we're bringing you the most powerful testimonies from the Pacific Theater that history has almost forgotten. The logbook began on December 7, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when Wake Island's small garrison received word that America was at war. Major Putnam commanded Fighter Squadron 211, a unit of 12 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters that represented the island's primary air defense. What he couldn't have known as he prepared his pilots for combat was that Wake Island would become the first place where American forces would successfully repel a major Japanese amphibious assault, proving that the Imperial Navy was not invincible and giving hope to a nation reeling from the disaster at Pearl Harbor. Wake Island sits like a tiny emerald in the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, roughly 2,300 miles west of Hawaii and 1,500 miles east of Guam. In 1941, it served as a crucial refueling stop for trans-Pacific flights and housed a small but strategically important military base. The island's total area was less than 3 square miles, shaped like a wishbone with 3 main sections connected by narrow strips of land. Its highest point rose barely 20 feet above sea level, offering little natural protection from the storms that regularly swept across the Pacific or from the human storm that was about to engulf its defenders. Paul Putnam grew up in Buffalo, New York, the son of a World War I veteran who had instilled in him a deep sense of duty and patriotism. After graduating from the Naval Academy in 1936, he had chosen Marine Corps aviation, drawn by the challenge of carrier-based flying and the elite reputation of Marine fighter pilots. His early letters home revealed a young officer who took his responsibilities seriously, but maintained the easy confidence that came with superior training and equipment. He had married his college sweetheart, Margaret, just 6 months before shipping out to Wake Island, and his early diary entries were filled with plans for their future together and descriptions of the exotic Pacific assignment that he initially viewed as an adventure. The Wake Island that Major Putnam arrived at in November 1941 was a bustling construction site as well as a military outpost. Pan American Airways operated a luxury hotel for wealthy trans-Pacific passengers, complete with fine dining and comfortable accommodations that seemed almost surreal in such a remote location. Alongside the civilian facilities, military contractors were rushing to complete new fortifications, airstrips, and defensive positions as tensions with Japan escalated throughout the fall of 1941. Putnam wrote about the strange juxtaposition of luxury tourists sipping cocktails while construction workers built machine gun nests and Marines conducted combat training exercises on the coral beaches. His Fighter Squadron 211 consisted of 12 Grumman F-4F-3 Wildcat fighters, representing some of the most advanced aircraft in the American arsenal at the time. These planes, with their rugged construction and reliable Pratt & Whitney engines, were specifically designed for carrier operations and had already proven themselves in combat with British pilots flying American-built versions against the Germans. Putnam's pilots were experienced professionals, many with hundreds of hours of flight time and advanced training in aerial combat tactics. They had confidence in their aircraft, their skills, and their ability to defend Wake Island against any threat the Japanese might pose. The squadron's daily routine involved dawn reconnaissance patrols, maintenance work on the aircraft, and regular training flights to maintain combat readiness. Putnam's logbook entries from late November and early December 1941 revealed a unit that was well prepared for war but still hoping it might not come. The pilots had developed strong bonds with the island's other defenders, including the Marine Ground Forces under Major James Devereaux and the Navy personnel who operated the island's communications and support facilities. These relationships would prove crucial in the desperate days ahead, as the different services worked together in ways that peacetime training had never fully prepared them for. On December 6, 1941, Putnam wrote what would be his last peacetime entry, noting that intelligence reports suggested increased Japanese naval activity in the Central Pacific, but expressing confidence that American forces were ready for whatever might come. He mentioned receiving letters from Margaret, who was staying with her parents in California while he completed his Pacific deployment, and his plans to request leave for a visit home after the holidays. Within 24 hours, those plans would be shattered by events beyond anyone's control, and Major Putnam would begin documenting one of the most heroic defensive actions in American military history. Have you ever wondered how small groups of Americans cut off from all support found the courage to fight against impossible odds in the early days of World War II? December 8, 1941 dawned clear and calm over Wake Island, but the peaceful morning was shattered at 11:58 a.m. when the first wave of Japanese bombers appeared on the horizon like a dark cloud against the blue Pacific sky. Major Putnam was in the operations bunker reviewing patrol schedules when the air raid sirens began their haunting wail, sending military personnel and civilian contractors scrambling for whatever shelter they could find on the flat, exposed coral atoll. His logbook entry for that day captured the shock and confusion of America's entry into World War II from the perspective of men who suddenly found themselves on the front lines of a global conflict. The Japanese attack came without warning, carried out by 36 twin-engine Mitsubishi G-3M bombers flying from bases in the Marshall Islands over 600 miles away. Putnam's fighters were caught on the ground during refueling operations, and within minutes, 8 of his 12 Wildcats were destroyed or damaged beyond repair in the initial bombing and strafing runs. The airfield's fuel storage tanks erupted in towering columns of black smoke, and the newly constructed hangars collapsed under the weight of falling bombs and debris. Most devastating of all, 23 military personnel were killed in those first few minutes of combat, including several of Putnam's most experienced pilots, who had been preparing their aircraft for patrol duty. But the attack also revealed something crucial about both the Japanese operational planning and the American defensive preparations. The enemy bombers had focused primarily on the airfield and obvious military targets, leaving many of the island's defensive positions intact and operational. Major Devereaux's Marines had dispersed their artillery and anti-aircraft guns in carefully camouflaged positions around the island's perimeter, making them difficult to spot from the air and even harder to destroy with conventional bombing attacks. Putnam wrote about watching the Japanese formation wheel around for a second pass, noting with professional interest that their tactics seemed designed for attacking static targets rather than engaging in the kind of prolonged campaign that Wake Island's defense would require. The real test came 3 days later on December 11th, when a Japanese invasion fleet appeared on the horizon in the pre-dawn darkness. Putnam's remaining 4 Wildcats were airborne before sunrise, conducting reconnaissance missions that revealed the true scope of the threat facing Wake Island's defenders. The invasion force consisted of 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 patrol boats, 2 submarines, and 2 troop transports carrying over 450 Japanese Special Naval Landing Force troops, elite amphibious assault specialists trained specifically for operations against fortified positions on small islands. What happened next became legendary in Marine Corps history and marked the first time that shore-based artillery successfully repelled a major amphibious assault by the Japanese Imperial Navy. As the enemy warships moved into position to support the landing operation, Major Devereux's carefully positioned coastal defense guns opened fire with devastating accuracy. The lead cruiser, Yubari, took direct hits that disabled her main armament and forced her to withdraw from the battle line. Even more dramatically, the destroyer Hayate suffered a catastrophic explosion when an American shell penetrated her magazine, sending the 1,400-ton warship to the bottom with all hands in a matter of seconds. Putnam's Wildcats joined the battle with coordinated strafing attacks on the remaining Japanese vessels, their .50 caliber machine guns raking the decks of destroyers and transports while the pilots pushed their aircraft to the limits of performance in the low-altitude combat environment. One of his pilots, Captain Henry Elrod, managed to score bomb hits on the destroyer Kisaragi, which also exploded and sank with heavy loss of life among her crew and the embarked Special Naval Landing Force troops. The sight of 2 Japanese warships burning and sinking in Wake Island's lagoon sent shockwaves through the invasion fleet and forced the overall commander to order a general withdrawal, marking the first tactical defeat suffered by Japanese forces since the beginning of their Pacific offensive. The successful repulse of the first invasion attempt electrified American morale at a time when news from the Pacific had been uniformly disastrous. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Singapore had all fallen to Japanese attacks, and Wake Island's victory proved that American forces could fight effectively against their new enemy when properly prepared and courageously led. Putnam wrote about the celebration that followed the battle, noting that both military personnel and civilian contractors shared in the satisfaction of having struck back successfully against the forces that had attacked Pearl Harbor just 4 days earlier. The euphoria of victory proved short-lived as Japanese forces regrouped and began a systematic campaign to isolate and weaken Wake Island's defenders before attempting another invasion. Starting on December 12th, enemy bombers began arriving over the island twice daily, conducting methodical attacks designed to destroy remaining aircraft, eliminate defensive positions, and wear down the morale of the American garrison through constant pressure and the threat of death from above. Putnam's logbook entries from this period revealed the psychological toll of living under continuous bombardment, while trying to maintain effective military operations with dwindling resources and personnel. The most immediate problem facing Wake Island's defenders was the progressive destruction of their air capability. Putnam's 4 remaining Wildcats were operating under increasingly difficult conditions, with spare parts cannibalized from wrecked aircraft and fuel supplies carefully rationed to ensure maximum effectiveness during combat missions. Each time his pilots took off, they faced overwhelming numerical odds against Japanese formations that typically included 20 to 30 bombers escorted by an equal number of Zero fighters flying from newly captured bases in the Marshall Islands. The mathematical reality was stark and unavoidable. Every American aircraft lost brought the island closer to losing its ability to contest Japanese air superiority over the surrounding waters. By December 15th, only 2 Wildcats remained operational, and Putnam found himself making the agonizing decision to ground one aircraft to provide spare parts for the other. His logbook entry for that day captured the frustration and desperation of a professional military officer watching his command slowly disintegrate despite the courage and skill of his remaining personnel. He wrote about Captain Elrod, who continued flying solo combat missions against entire Japanese formations, returning each time with his aircraft riddled with bullet holes but still capable of flight. The image of a single American fighter attacking formations of 20 or more enemy aircraft became symbolic of Wake Island's entire defensive effort, heroic but ultimately unsustainable against overwhelming odds. The situation on the ground was becoming equally desperate as Japanese bombing attacks took their toll on both military installations and the civilian population that remained trapped on the island. The Pan American Airways Hotel had been converted into a makeshift hospital, its elegant dining room now filled with wounded Marines and construction workers who continued to man defensive positions despite their injuries. Putnam wrote about visiting the wounded and being struck by their determination to continue fighting, even as medical supplies ran low and proper treatment became impossible due to the constant threat of air attack. Food and water were becoming critical concerns as the siege entered its second week. The Japanese had targeted the island's freshwater storage tanks during their bombing attacks, forcing defenders to rely on whatever rainwater they could collect and the limited supplies available from emergency stockpiles. Meals consisted of canned rations distributed once daily, with portions carefully calculated to extend supplies for as long as possible, while maintaining the strength necessary for continued resistance. Putnam noted that both military personnel and civilian contractors shared equally in the hardships, with no distinction made between those who had volunteered for military service and those who had simply been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps most psychologically damaging was the complete isolation from the outside world and the growing realization that no relief force was coming to lift the siege. Radio communications with Pearl Harbor had been sporadic since the beginning of the Japanese attacks, and the few messages that got through carried increasingly pessimistic assessments of the strategic situation in the Pacific. Putnam wrote about the moment when defenders realized they were truly on their own, cut off from reinforcement or resupply, facing an enemy that could attack them at will while they had no capacity to strike back at Japanese bases or supply lines. December 22, 1941 brought ominous signs that the Japanese were preparing for their second and final invasion attempt. Putnam's last operational Wildcat had been destroyed during an air raid 3 days earlier, leaving Wake Island completely defenseless against aerial attack and unable to conduct reconnaissance missions that might provide early warning of approaching enemy forces. The island's radar equipment had also been destroyed, forcing defenders to rely on visual observation posts that were themselves vulnerable to bombing and strafing attacks by Japanese aircraft that now roamed the skies around Wake Island with complete impunity. Throughout the day, Japanese bombers and fighters conducted almost continuous attacks on the island's remaining defensive positions, systematically targeting the coastal artillery batteries that had proven so effective during the first invasion attempt. Putnam wrote about watching the methodical destruction of positions that had taken months to construct and fortify, noting with professional admiration the skill with which Japanese pilots identified and attacked the most important elements of Wake Island's defense system. By evening, most of the large-caliber guns had been destroyed or damaged, and many of the carefully prepared firing positions were no longer tenable due to the accumulation of bomb damage and debris. The second Japanese invasion fleet approached under cover of darkness during the early morning hours of December 23rd, having learned from the failures of the first attempt, and now including additional warships and nearly 1,000 assault troops rather than the 450 that had participated in the earlier landing. 2 destroyers, Hayate and Oite, had been converted into high-speed transports carrying special naval landing force troops directly to Wake Island's beaches, while cruisers and additional destroyers provided fire support from positions beyond the range of any surviving American coastal defense guns. Major Putnam's final logbook entries were written in the command bunker as Japanese forces established their first foothold on Wake Island's beaches and began advancing inland against the desperate resistance of the remaining American defenders. His handwriting, normally precise and controlled, became increasingly erratic as exhaustion and the stress of continuous combat took their toll. He wrote about Major Devereux's decision to establish a final defensive perimeter around the island's communications center, concentrating the surviving Marines and armed civilians in positions where they might hold out longest against the overwhelming enemy assault. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed was among the most vicious of the Pacific War, with American defenders using every available weapon to contest each yard of coral and sand as Japanese forces pushed inland from multiple landing sites. Putnam, though trained as a pilot rather than an infantry officer, found himself commanding a mixed group of Marines, sailors, and civilian contractors armed with rifles, machine guns, and improvised weapons salvaged from the wreckage of the airfield and destroyed aircraft. His account of the final battle captured the chaos and heroism of men who knew they were fighting a losing battle but refused to surrender while they still had ammunition and the strength to resist. The end came at 7:30 a.m. on December 23rd when Major Devereux, facing the complete destruction of his command and the certain death of the remaining wounded who could not be moved from the makeshift hospital, made the agonizing decision to surrender Wake Island to prevent further useless bloodshed. Putnam's last diary entry, written just minutes before American forces laid down their arms, consisted of a single sentence repeated 3 times. "We held them for 16 days. We held them for 16 days. We held them for 16 days." These words, more than any official military report, captured the essence of Wake Island's defense and the price paid by 400 Americans who had fought against impossible odds in the opening days of America's involvement in World War II. What do you think motivated these isolated American defenders to continue fighting when they knew that defeat was inevitable and that no rescue was possible? Major Paul Putnam's survival through nearly 4 years of Japanese imprisonment was itself a testament to the same determination that had characterized Wake Island's defense. His captivity began with a forced march to the island's airfield, where Japanese troops had established a temporary prisoner processing center among the wreckage of the American aircraft that had defended the atoll during its 16-day siege. Putnam wrote about the surreal experience of walking past the burned-out remains of his Wildcats while Japanese soldiers photographed the captured American officers for propaganda purposes, creating images that would be distributed throughout the Pacific to demonstrate the invincibility of Japanese arms. The 1,600 American prisoners from Wake Island were eventually divided into different groups and transported to various prison camps throughout the Japanese Empire, with officers and enlisted men deliberately separated to prevent the maintenance of military organization and discipline. Putnam found himself aboard a Japanese transport ship bound for prison camps in Manchuria, where he would spend the next 3.5 years in conditions designed to break the spirit and destroy the health of captured enemy personnel. His hidden diary, written on scraps of paper concealed in his clothing and personal effects, provided a detailed record of the systematic brutality and calculated cruelty that characterized Japanese treatment of American prisoners of war. The psychological impact of captivity proved in many ways more devastating than the physical hardships, as American officers trained to lead and take responsibility for their men found themselves powerless to protect subordinates from beatings, starvation, and medical neglect. Putnam wrote about watching fellow Wake Island defenders die slowly from diseases that could have been easily treated with proper medical care, about witnessing executions of prisoners who violated arbitrary rules they couldn't understand, and about the gradual erosion of hope as months turned into years, without any indication that the war might end or that liberation might be possible. Yet even in the darkest circumstances, Putnam found ways to maintain his sense of purpose and connection to the larger struggle against Japanese aggression. He organized clandestine educational programs for younger prisoners, teaching navigation, mathematics, and military history using improvised materials and relying entirely on memory for content. He helped establish covert communication networks that allowed American prisoners in different parts of the camp to share information and coordinate resistance activities, including sabotage operations against Japanese industrial facilities that used prisoner labor. Most importantly, Putnam continued documenting his experiences and those of his fellow prisoners, recognizing that these testimonies might someday serve as evidence in war crimes trials, and as historical records of American courage under the most extreme circumstances. His prison diary became a collaborative effort, with other Wake Island survivors contributing their own accounts and memories to create a comprehensive record of both the island's defense and the subsequent treatment of its defenders. This hidden archive, carefully maintained despite the enormous risks involved, represented a form of resistance that the Japanese could never completely suppress. Liberation came on August 20, 1945, when Soviet forces overran the Manchurian prison camp where Putnam had spent the final months of the war. His diary entry from that day was brief but powerful, consisting simply of the date followed by a single word repeated over and over: free, 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 free. But freedom brought its own challenges as Putnam and the other survivors struggled to readjust to a world that had moved on without them. and to process the trauma of prolonged captivity under brutal conditions. Putnam returned to the United States in October 1945, weighing less than 120 pounds and suffering from multiple diseases contracted during imprisonment. He was medically retired from the Marine Corps in 1946 and spent the rest of his life dealing with the physical and psychological consequences of his wartime experiences. He never spoke publicly about Wake Island or his imprisonment, preferring to let his hidden diary serve as his testimony to what had happened during those crucial 16 days in December 1941 and the long years of captivity that followed. Major Paul Putnam died in 1981 at the age of 63. Having lived long enough to see Wake Island transformed from a forgotten battlefield into a symbol of American determination and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds. His diary, donated to the Marine Corps Historical Center by his family, remains one of the most complete and powerful first-person accounts of the early Pacific War, and the price paid by the men who held the line during America's darkest hours. The final entry, written shortly before his death, consisted of a simple statement that summarized his entire life. Wake Island taught me that ordinary Americans can do extraordinary things when their country needs them most. Today, Wake Island serves as a wildlife refuge and emergency landing site for trans-Pacific flights, its coral runways and concrete bunkers slowly being reclaimed by the Pacific environment that witnessed one of the most heroic defensive actions in American military history. The island's 400 defenders fighting alone against impossible odds for 16 crucial days in December 1941 proved that American forces could stand against Japanese aggression and hold their ground until the vast industrial and military resources of the United States could be mobilized for victory. Their sacrifice bought precious time for America to recover from Pearl Harbor and begin the long fight back across the Pacific toward ultimate victory over the forces that had brought war to the world. Did you know that Wake Island's 16-day defense became a rallying cry for American forces throughout the Pacific War, inspiring countless acts of heroism by men who remembered that 400 Americans had held their ground when retreat or surrender might have seemed the only rational options?